Michael Horsworth. You are Managing Director for the North America Behavioral Insights team and Assistant Professor at the Columbia University. You are also a leading figure in developing the field of applying behavioral science to the government. And today we will speak about your book, Behavioral Insights, which is basically about how humans behave when facing practical problems. Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, Michael, we are in unprecedented times. In these last 12 months, we have changed practically in many of our behaviors. So your book starts by telling us that many of our behaviors are unconscious. They are just habits and we don't think about it. But now this year two of a curveball, and now we have to rethink everything. Should I go out? Should I not go out? Should I put a mask? Shouldn't I put a mask on? So it's quite weird. This year make us reconsider our own patterns and so I'm happy to have this conversation with you about the way that we behave, how much is automatic, how much we can change, how much is conscious, how much is unconscious. But I would like to start by knowing a little bit about yourself. I see from your CV that you came all the way from the other side of the continent, from England, and I wonder how is it that you became interested in this field?
Yeah, absolutely. So I come from the context of trying to find new ways of making government, public policy work better. I didn't come from the perspective of, what makes humans tick and so on, although that's clearly a really interesting question. Instead, I was thinking, are there new sources of evidence that policymakers and others in the private sector as well could be using to help understand human behavior better, things that they really have to take into account when developing plans or policies to prevent unintended consequences or problems, or just less effective designs for what they're trying to do. So I was very much a kind of coming from the practical government side of it. How can we get the best possible evidence to improve society? And at the time, 12, 13 years ago, what was particularly apparent was that, government and others and organizations could learn quite a bit from behavioral science, from the findings that were emerging that, as you said, a lot of our behavior is driven more by these kind of non-conscious automatic reactions than we tend to think. So the question was, what would you do differently?
Okay, well, before we get there, so you tell us this is where you focus your story, your life. But when you were a young kid, why is it that make you decide to go into this field? Why you were practically going through the whole way of your school and you were saying, what should I do with my life? I know I'm going to develop my life to behavioral science. I don't know. Is that how it went?
No, not at all. Okay. I think the United Kingdom is strange in some senses because, you may find it strange in other senses, but the one I'm thinking of is our education system. We often do something different from the thing we studied. And that's quite different from the United States, for example, I have noticed, where it's more like you study law, you become a lawyer. So in the UK, it's more kind of chance happens, or you take different routes. So my first degree, and indeed my second, was in English literature. Now that is very different from my PhD, which is running randomized control trials and doing statistical analyses of data. And the way it happened was I was, interested in policy issues, and that became the bridge. I started, for one reason or another, doing work on how do you determine whether governments are having an impact, and then it transitioned to what are the best ways that the government could be acting to have the best results? And that comes back to what I was just saying. Behavioral science is a big issue then, coming to the fore. There is one connecting factor, though, which is that language is really important. And that is a thread that connects my earlier education, because you do spend a lot of time thinking about the impact that certain words, phrases have on people. And a lot of my work now is also looking at that, except the difference is we kind of run these experiments to see how do, say, one set of words translate into behavior compared to another set of words. Same ideas, but different approach.
Right. And why government? Were you an activist or something like that? Because the same field of behavioral science, if you work for the private sector, I'm sure they are willing to pay you 2 or 3 times as much in order to get consumers to consume twice as much. How can we get inside of the head of the consumers in order for them to order more food, to buy more clothes, to buy a more expensive car, to buy a bigger house? And in the private sector, I mean, obviously you were not motivated by money since you used to work for the government. So, but can you tell us why government?
Yes. So I think it's really interesting because government, this may be a negative way of looking at it, but it's the place that all the really difficult and hard to solve problems go to. One way of looking at it is what's called market failure. Government steps in when the market can't sort things out. And that means it often deals with really kind of complex issues where there isn't a clear solution, where you have to work hard to try and find a way forward, but which are really important. Like, they really affect all of us throughout society. And I find that interesting when you've got complex problems which matter to everybody. And I think that's more attractive to me than selling one particular thing in that wider context, if you see what I mean.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, I just wanted to get behind your motivation.
Yeah.
So instead of getting people to buy an extra ounce of this or that, you want to influence society. How can we get a whole population to alter their behavior for their own good? So yeah, but that makes sense. Okay. So then, what inspired you to write this book, Behavioral Insights? And can you just for a moment also mention the name of your co-author?
Absolutely. So this is a book that came out a couple of months ago called Behavioral Insights. It's written by me and my colleague Elspeth Kirkman, and it's published by MIT Press. And it's a short introduction to the idea of behavioral insights. It came about because we were approached by the publisher, who had heard about this concept, behavioral insights, and had read a blog that Elspeth and I had done, which was they thought it was interesting because it was actually about how can behavioral science learn from literature, and how can literature learn from behavioral science. Now, I don't go around writing about this very often, and I happen just to have mentioned it to you in this podcast, but it's a coincidence. We were saying that actually, if you look at famous works of literature, they have a lot to say about behavior as well. We don't think about it in a kind of scientific way. So, it was quite a fun thing to write. The publishers thought, okay, this is pretty interesting, this angle. What is this concept, behavioral insights? Can you write an introduction to us that explains it all for someone who's interested but doesn't really understand it?
Wow, that's quite funny because I like to believe that many of the behaviors that I apply to my own life, they are from fictional characters in books. I spend
Yeah.
so many hours reading, and then I identify with a character, and then I will say to myself, what would this character do in this kind of situation? And I kind of mold myself to the image of this character. So that's a nice coincidence in regards to your work. Okay, so can you give us in lame terms exactly what is behavioral insights?
Absolutely. So the one sentence definition is that behavioral insights is an approach that uses findings about the conscious and non-conscious drivers of behavior to address practical problems. And there's a lot in that sentence, I recognize, but what it comes down to is there are three main things going on here. The first thing is around evidence about behavior. And you mentioned this kind of idea of non-conscious and conscious. And this has been kind of explained particularly famously by Daniel Kahneman, who wrote this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, as system one and system two. You know, there are two kind of main drivers of our behavior, how we deal with, we interpret the world and so on. One is this kind of fast, intuitive, automatic way of thinking, which is what happens if I say to you, what's 2 times 2? You don't need to think about it, it's 4. And this other way of thinking, which is slow, effortful, conscious, requires us to concentrate. And that's more like, you know, if I say to you, what's 24 times 17? You then have to work it through. And the kind of insight is that much more of our behavior falls into that first category, the fast or automatic intuitive way of thinking, than we tend to think. And the concern is that we develop products or develop policies that don't take that insight into account. So there's a whole body of findings around this kind of non-conscious driver of our behavior that we bring to the table with behavioral insights. But it's not just a collection of findings, which takes me on to the second bit, which is it's an approach, it's a practical application of these findings to real world problems. We came actually, my organization, the Behavioral Insights team, came from the UK government. We were there confronted with practical problems. And we wanted to apply these kind of findings to real world issues that were really pressing. And so it's not just knowledge for its own sake, it's what can we do to tackle this problem? So it's applied. And then the third aspect of it is that we try and evaluate, we try and measure what we do. We don't just say, here's a solution and implement it and that's done. We say, what impact did we have by changing this thing? How much improvement did we bring? And we often do this through experimentation. And that enables us to keep learning. So it's those three things together: evidence about behavior, practical focus, and experimentation that means behavioral insights as a whole.
And how about influencing or asking people to take action upon your findings? And I'll give you the most typical example right now. We can see from behavior that Asian countries, they don't get as many coronavirus as we do because they have this behavior of wearing masks. And to convince, I don't know, half of the population of the United States to wear a mask, it seems almost impossible. And I mean, we have the evidence there, but you know, it just becomes, you got all the elements there except the willingness, the willingness of people to follow upon the suggestions recommended by I don't know, the health organizations.
Yeah. So what we can do is try to use the evidence findings about behavior to understand why there are these barriers. And one very obvious barrier that's been talked about a lot in the United States is political polarization. Mm. And then you get under the surface of why does that work? How does that work? You know, there's a very strong finding around what's called in-group and out-group behavior. And if you see that a particular action is associated with an out-group, people not like you, that's a very strong driver not to do it. Mm. And these things kind of build on each other because another very strong driver is social norms, what you see other people do. So if you don't see anyone in your local area wearing a mask, that's a very strong indicator and stasis that emerges that is difficult to break out of. And these are kind of intuitive, strong factors. Now we can try and break some of those down by sometimes like making it easier to do the behavior. That's a big factor. We tend to, conserve our effort and like don't want to go to too much effort to perform behavior, particularly if we're not sure about it. So you can, for example, hand people masks as they go into shops. Now that's not definitely going to work, but if people are on the fence about this behavior, it might just push them over into doing it because it's kind of easier not to if someone hands it to you. But I'm not saying there are any easy answers here, because you have to then look at these very strong driving behaviors of, things like confirmation bias. Once you get an idea into your head, you see the world through that lens.
Yes.
The point of getting towards a solution is hard, but some of these findings allow us to understand the behaviors better, at least. And, hard work can mean we get to a better solution using those findings.
Right. Okay. So I threw you a very difficult problem. How about, can you highlight one or two of the examples that you share with us in your book?
Yeah, absolutely. There are many examples. I've been working in this field for 10, 11 years, and the behavioral insights approach has been applied in different areas. So maybe you can cut that bit as I have to think. Hang on, I'm trying to think of a good example. Well, okay, there's a nice example that is relevant to our conversation, which is a study that was done 10 or 11 years ago about hand washing. And I think of it because of coronavirus. And I think it's nice because it shows how you can do experiments that are quite reliable and which are different from what people will tell you they do. So I'll explain what I mean. This study was around hand washing in service stations by the side of the highway motorway. It was actually in the UK. And what they did was they put different messages in front of the soap that you get in the bathrooms. And these were actually, I think, LED messages. So they could change them repeatedly. And they also attached these sensors to the soaps. They knew how much soap people were using. And then they varied the messages and saw the relationship between the message that went up and the amount of soap that was being used. And what's interesting about this is you need reliable measures of behavior, because what people do and what people say they do are often different. And that's particularly true if you go ask people, did you just wash your hands there?
Everyone will say yes.
People are going to say, sure, yeah. Well, we know they don't. And instead, if you measure it through an unobtrusive means of how much soap, you get a much more accurate picture. And they found some really interesting things, like that there were different findings by gender. Men were much more motivated by kind of disgust-based messages. Like, I think it was things like wash it off or eat it later, or something, that kind of thing. And whereas I think women were more motivated by kind of straightforward informational messages around, the benefits of hand washing. That's my memory of it anyway. But what I thought was really interesting about that was it took something kind of every day and showed how the prompts at the very moment you're hand washing, not like a day before you saw something and maybe it influences you. It's got to be like immediate in front of you. And we know that has a relationship with what you actually do. And it feels like that's a realistic thing you could do by changing the signs in front of the soap to encourage hand washing. And it just came to my mind because it shows, again, the power of language on behavior.
Right.
If it's done in the right way, if it's there at the moment and it's short and, it doesn't try and do too much, it gets through to people.
Okay, how about, are there any ethical implications in regards to behavioral insights? Will people criticize saying that this is manipulation of how we behave and that we don't like to be manipulated, especially by government organizations?
Yeah, so we talk about this in the book at some length, and it was actually really interesting to write that because obviously I've been listening to these kind of critiques for many years now, and it was really interesting to bring them all together and then try and think about them. And what I would say is, it doesn't help to think about these things in the abstract because you're always dealing with a practical problem. And that practical problem has always involves certain kinds of costs and benefits. So what we do is we actually say, here's a way of working through the ethical issues for any particular problem that you're facing. And we say there are kind of, four things going on here. One is the level of control that someone has to resist an intervention. And I won't go into depth there, but that there are various levels of control you can have. The second one is around transparency. How easy is it to understand, the existence of the influence, how it's being used, and what its intent is? Then, what are people's views on the matter? Do they have a really strong settled view they don't want to do this behavior, or are they kind of less bothered about that? And then finally, what are the costs and benefits involved? Are we talking about preventing, somebody from suffering a really bad consequence to themselves? Because if we are, we may be more justified in a more intensive kind of intervention that might be more ethically justified, like preventing suicide at the moment where someone's really distressed, and that might open the door to greater paternalism. So we don't try and answer these criticisms in the abstract. Well, I think there are answers as well. We just say, here's the way of working through in a practical context.
Right. Okay. My last question. So I'm so delighted that you decided to go into behavioral insights on the side of the government and with the kind of view of helping society as a whole. But I'm afraid of the future of behavioral insights on the side of corporate because they have tons of people trying to figure out how to make us addicted to their products, how to make us consume more, how to make us dependent on whatever merchandise, product, or service they use. And as you mentioned at the beginning of the book, most of our actions are unconscious. So I'm just afraid that all these corporations with the millions and billions of dollars, they manage to manipulate. In fact, they already do manipulate the way we think and behave. So I'm just afraid that this is going to just go deeper and deeper upon this route.
It's a great question. So I think the kind of cynical answer is that in a market, the players in the market will always try to maximize their advantage. And evidence about human behavior is potentially a way of doing that. And you do see this, absolutely. You see what's called dark patterns. So this is the kind of thing where corporations maybe try and pre-tick a box you don't see because they know that the way our attention works means we were unlikely to notice or untick that box. So it feels to me like, I know it's a very difficult problem to deal with because some of the behavioral approach is not clearly different from, if you like, business as usual. Like where do you draw the line for
Right.
things that become, behaviorally informed or so on? It's really tough. I do know there have been some thoughts about this in the online space. I believe there was actually a bill introduced in the US, maybe in California. I think it's called the Discover Act, which tries to look at online manipulation. And maybe something more will come there. I see it as, if you're really concerned about this, you might have to look at some form of regulation. Who knows? Because if there really isn't a strong volume of harm going on, then you should treat it as any other kind of approach, really. You look at, is there a case for regulation? It's just really hard to get a grip on what are we talking about here.
Right.
I would, and there could be unintended consequences from such regulations. So I haven't got an easy answer for you, I'm afraid. It's really tough.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I got into podcasts as a personal finance podcaster 3 years ago. And at that time, I was coaching some people. And it would drive me crazy that I had a client who struggled to pay her rent or his rent. Yet, if the new iPhone costing $1,000 would come out, she would stand in line to buy that phone because she was just so, I don't know, manipulated is the word that comes to my mind by the advertisement and the way that Apple have make her behave. And now she, even though she couldn't afford her rent, she had to buy this new gadget. And so I just saw that as a way that the corporations are manipulating us. And I just felt helpless because no matter what I said, she was going to stand in line to buy that new phone, which was better than the one she bought the previous year.
I think I return to my original point that you need to understand what's driving that behavior
Right.
as a starting point, because
Right.
otherwise you're going to make maybe false assumptions. So that's what we try and do.
Right. Okay. Well, this is a fascinating topic, Michael. Can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where people can follow you?
Sure. And the title of the book is Behavioral Insights, and you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is at M Halsworth.
Perfect. Michael, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks. Pleasure being with you today.